Great. Thank you very much. And I suppose this is the first gig of the summit kicking off formally. So welcome to Washington. I'm joined by Alex Meek-Holmes. My name's Liam Maxwell. I'm the Director of Government Transformation at AWS. And my team helps public service leaders around the world with their modernization programs. And we help operational leaders and senior leaders in government accelerate their reforms and modernization programs. I'm a former civil servant, so I was the first Chief Technology Officer for the United Kingdom government and then the National Technology Advisor. So part of this is and part of what we're talking about today links very closely with government, so I'm hopefully able to give a perspective from both sides, from the government and also from the technology side of this. Alex, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yep. Hi, I'm Alex Meek-Holmes. I'm a Senior Manager of Government Transformation in Liam's team. You may be able to hear from my accent, I'm also British. I was also a UK civil servant. I spent 16 years in the UK civil service. I was in Her Majesty's Treasury. I worked in the Cabinet Office, which is right in the centre of government, leading some work on the cloud strategy. And my last role 3 years ago, before I came to AWS, was heading up our cybersecurity strategy across the UK economy.
Great. So, as I said earlier, one of the things that the main reason for our team is to help us and help customers, government customers, with their modernization programs and helping them drive through reforms. So a lot of the work that we do involves talking and understanding customer needs and customer requirements, some of which are around technology, some of which are around policy, and helping put together programs to help them move forward across government. And that's across the whole of government, so from defense to transport to benefits to welfare, and also we work globally. So our remit is around the world, and the team we run, we have one person in Seattle, we have one person in Wellington, we've got about 30 people in between the two around the world, so we can help people move and deliver their reform programs quickly, effectively, but also leveraging technology effectively. And just to come, how the core component of the team is we have a group of former public service leaders in the team who have delivered nation-scale reform. So we have Maria Inés Bach, somewhere in the audience here as well, who is the Permanent Secretary of the Department of Modernization in Argentina and led the national program of modernization in Argentina, including the delivery of the identity card and the identity system. Mike Bevan, who was the chief transformer within the UK government and led the transformation of 25 government services over an 18-month period, saving billions of pounds to help deliver new ways of working and new services within the UK. Jane Treadwell, who was one of the first female CIOs in national level in Australia, and then worked extensively in the World Bank, and also Alex and myself, and we have a new leader who joined recently, Choi Peng Wu, who was the first and founding CIO of Singapore. And as you may have seen, all of the changes that happened in Singapore as a result of Choi Peng's work, you can see that we're building a really strong team here of people who can help officials and help leaders understand how to get their changes through. We do that in a number of ways. So there's an advisory team who go and talk to, understand, listen to customers and help understand their advisory motion. We also find that pretty much every operational civil service needs to have capacity building, capability building, and so we run an executive education program for leaders in government to help them understand and get to the grips with the reforms and the changes that they'll need to undertake. We also provide and build some open source tooling and tools which help people move forward, one of which a good example is Open Government Solutions, which is the comprehensive listing of open source used in government around the world. And we also put together the business cases to help build infrastructure solutions for governments and for new countries. So when we're looking to expand into new countries, we help put together the business case on the public sector side of that engagement. So brief introduction. So we're deeply embedded in government, deeply embedded in how AWS can help governments. Today we're going to really talk through the changes and the issues that are happening around control and the ability to control data. And that's a really hot topic internationally. It's also a really hot topic in certain parts of the States. So it's really interesting to talk this through. It's going to be a double act here. First time we've tried this. So Alex and I are going to try a double act. I'm going to pass over to him in a second to give you the briefing in this and security baselines. And then we're going to have a bit of a question and answer session ourselves. But then we're also looking forward to your questions and answers on this very detailed topic. So if you could save your questions for then, that'd be really kind. But we'd really like to get your feedback and also your questions around the topics we discussed today. So Alex, with that introduction, over to you.
Brilliant, thank you. And if today goes well, then we will also perform it at the Edinburgh Fringe, I think, is the plan.
That's right.
So the title of the topic is Data Sovereignty, Privacy, and Security. And I've used all three terms deliberately in the title, and because actually there's lots of overlap between these terms, and it's something we hear a lot about from customers, and they may ask about data sovereignty, they may ask about privacy or data protection, and they talk about security and compliance. And what we've learned is actually they may say one thing, but they mean another thing. And particularly in Europe at the moment, there's lots of talk about data sovereignty. And I think it's important to get underneath about what the customer or people are actually asking about when they say data sovereignty, because they may say data sovereignty, but really it's a conversation about security. Data sovereignty is also a bit of a marketing term at the moment, so again, particularly in Europe. So you see it being thrown around and people talking about sovereign clouds and data sovereignty, and sometimes vendors can mean it to use what they want it to mean. And sometimes they will talk about sovereignty whilst trying to sell something which actually has a lot of anti-cloud patterns in it and doesn't get the full benefits of the cloud. And I'll talk about that in a second. I could make up another definition of data sovereignty to meet this and help with this talk now, but I think it's probably useful to use some recognized definitions, and one I'd like to go to is the IDC white paper, which they wrote recently on digital sovereignty and data sovereignty, and they say, data sovereignty is the concept of data being subject to the laws and governance structures within the country it's collected or pertains to. I'm quite a simple man, so perhaps on top of that, the way I like to think about it, and the way that Liam, I think, just referred to it, is it's about control over data. So you want control over your data and control who can access it and where it is. On the other hand, we'll go through the other terms as well. So data privacy is about protecting personally identifiable information, PII data, which goes very hand in hand with data protection. And of course, in Europe, we have the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, which is probably in a lot of top of your minds if you're trying to do business into Europe. And of course, here in the US, we've got the California Consumer Privacy Act, CCPA, but there's no equivalent of GDPR across the whole of the US. And then security, hopefully many more are familiar with the term security. And when we think about security, we think about confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And you can see there's an overlap there between those other terms already. So if you want to protect data, if you want to keep it private, you want to keep it confidential. And certainly if you want to control data, that's also about availability and confidentiality as well. So there is overlap around those. And I speak to, when we speak to customers about transformation and government transformation, often we get asked questions about things which may be holding them back. And they'll ask about data sovereignty. It's like, how does AWS support us with our data sovereignty requirements? How does the cloud give us control over the data? But one thing we also hear is customers want the full breadth and depth of the cloud. They have requirements over control, but they also, of course, have requirements over scalability, flexibility, speed of innovation, and security, and they don't want to sacrifice any of those to get that control. And again, sometimes when we've seen people sell sovereign cloud solutions, they're very happy to sacrifice all of those benefits of the cloud and provide something which is anti-cloud, because ultimately, if you want full control over something, you disconnect it from everything, and therefore you sacrifice your scalability and your speed of innovation, and security, which feels like an odd thing to sacrifice, sacrificing security and confidentiality to achieve sovereignty. And actually what we will see is in the vast majority of cases, you can meet your customer requirements, or customers can meet their requirements over control of data whilst getting all the full benefits of AWS Cloud. Sorry, lag on the clicker. So I've been talking about security, and I just want to make sure that we're all in the sort of same level of understanding. And I'm sure if you've had conversations with AWS before, you've seen the concept of the shared responsibility model. And this is quite a nice, colorful representation of that shared responsibility model. And what we say is AWS is responsible for security of the cloud, and customers are responsible for security and compliance in the cloud. And another way I like to think about this is we do the hard work of securing the infrastructure that supports the cloud, and then we give customers control and tools and services to control their data on top of that. So thinking about some examples. So as you know, we're both from the UK, and the UK Ministry of Defence have said that for the vast majority of workloads, which within data classification we call official, so it's 90% of government workloads within the UK Ministry of Defence, they said they can do a better job of securing those workloads using commercial cloud. And they give 3 examples of why that is. The first is patching. Now, when I was in the UK leading our cybersecurity strategy, it's very easy, and we always used to give advice saying, patch, patch, patch. You can be more secure if you patch, because it's one of the most common threat vectors in terms of protecting your workloads. It's an easy thing to tell everyone to patch. It's actually another thing, a much harder thing to do in reality, and particularly when you're managing physical infrastructure. So if you go back to 2018 and the Spectre vulnerability, which was a chip-level vulnerability, if you're managing your own data centers, it probably would have taken months to patch out the firmware to protect against the Spectre vulnerability. Whereas if you were using AWS, we released a patch on day 0 that the vulnerability was released. On day 1, all our EC2 servers were patched, and then day 2, all of our managed services were also patched. So AWS took care of that security heavy lifting for you, helping customers be secure without having to lift a finger. Then if you think about security in the cloud, we provide all these tools and services to be able to manage and control access at everything at scale and quickly, and I'll go on to that in a second. So if we're thinking about security in the cloud, let's go through what some of those services are. So if we're talking about confidentiality, data encryption. So all 117 AWS services that store customer data offer the ability to encrypt that data, which is a fundamental mechanism for preventing unauthorized access. And of course, we always recommend that our customers encrypt data at rest and provide the tools, of course, for encryption in transit as well. And the service we support with that is KMS. And KMS makes it incredibly easy, key management store, for customers to manage their encryption keys. They can bring their own keys as well. And AWS nor third-party providers have the ability to retrieve or disclose customer keys or access that key material. So not only are we providing the means to encrypt the data, but we don't have the means to access the key material to decrypt the data as well. And that's an important aspect, which I'll talk about in a second later in terms of access. If you want single tenant encryption service, we have Cloud HSM, the hardware security modules, which also run KMS, and they're certified to FIPS 142 for that extra level of security and control and authority over the key management. In addition, so encryption's one part of the story. We also have the ability, so identity and access management. Now, I think with AWS IAM, I think it's important to understand that it's not just some kind of Active Directory, but it gives you the ability not only to set who can access any resources, but what other resources can access resources and at what time. Then we have things like Control Tower that help you manage the rules around that. And then last year at reInvent, we announced some new guardrails for Control Tower to control what regions the data can be stored in to make sure that someone doesn't accidentally store data outside of the region or the country that you choose. We have monitoring logging services, so things like AWS CloudTrail, so you have a full audit of who's accessing what resources or who's accessing what resources at any given time, and then CloudWatch for real-time monitoring. And then we have Amazon Macie, which is a machine learning service, which can help you manage your personally identifiable PII data within the cloud to make sure that you're managing it in a compliant way. So for example, it can provide an inventory across S3 buckets and seeing what's unencrypted and what's publicly accessible. Now, within the zero trust model of cloud, I think it's really important that you don't just take our word for it, but we have a large number of third-party certifications and attestations to back up what we say. So of course, we've got the classic ISO suite, but within Europe, I think some really important certifications. So within Germany, we have C5, in Spain, ENS, and in HDS within France. And in addition to all of these, we have the Cloud Infrastructure Service Providers for Europe's Data Protection Code of Conduct. So this is called the CISSP Code of Conduct. And this is the first GDPR code of conduct specifically designed for cloud infrastructure providers, and it's validated both by the European Data Protection Board and approved by the French Data Protection Authority called CNIL. And this shows that AWS goes above and beyond GDPR compliance. I think it's a really important piece in terms of certification. And we never stop there as well. So we're always looking at adding to our suite of certifications and attestations. And you can see what we have today in AWS Artifact, which is a kind of go-to central resource for seeing these. But we're always looking for more and always open to having more of these. And actually, Liam, I think it's sort of worth saying that an important part of the journey within the UK cloud was we didn't actually develop yet another one of these. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Well, the whole point around the ability to have certifications and attestations is that you're able to really have your ability to demonstrate the security compliance that you've put in place and the data protection compliance as a service. We're not doing that with every single customer. We have it as a central service. And I think just giving a bit of perspective also, as Alex was talking about the issue around data and classification, data classification is another component of this, which is really important to think about. So lots of countries have very, very detailed data classifications between different layers of government and different approaches to security towards different levels of information. And if you think about how those go from the information that you share amongst intelligence agencies to the information that you share in order to process a benefit claim, there's obviously a difference between those two. When we went through and this is common for most governments that we see, when you go through the engagement of how people's data classification works, the complication actually leads to a lowering of the security posture we found. If you make it too complicated, people will end up using workarounds and different approaches to technology to get through that. In the UK in 2010, we inherited 6 main layers of security: top secret, secret, confidential, restricted, protected, and unclassified. And when you actually went through what people needed to do, and not just the impact of a threat, but the impact of a breach, but the threat of a breach, really what we wanted to do was spend quite a lot of money protecting the things in secret and top secret, and making sure that we had sovereign-based resources to help with that. And then secret and top secret, by the way, is intelligence agencies, and then secret is police in serious organized crime or anti-terrorism, or army and military in deployment. So that's that level. The rest of running police, rest of running defense, rest of running the justice system, the rest of running the court system, the rest of running population register, National Health Service, all of those components, all were not in that national security block. And so what we decided to do is to make a consistent approach to data classification across the whole of government that worked so that everything was protected properly and everything was protected to the highest grade of security for a good, solid public service organization. And so we created a data classification called Official. And everything in the government, essentially, and everything in public service runs at Official. And apart from the stuff that's in those two special groups, it's about 96% of the volume of data and processing is done at Official. The really important part behind that is that it means that you are able to guarantee much stronger guarantees around the security that you provide to the services at that level. And you're also able to operate with the agility and capability of the best public service organizations. And that's why one of the main reasons we did that. It led to much less many fewer security breaches, and you can see the difference between UK in the period up to 2010, 2011, 2013, and the period after. The performance of security during that has been much stronger, much higher compliance with that. And it's an approach we're finding lots of other governments are now starting to take. Going back to it, protect what you should, if you're running a public service organization in the same way that you're running a great public service firm or a financial firm, have that level of protection, because that keeps you at the right grade, but it also means that you're able to run your public services efficiently and effectively, but securing customer data in a professional and proper way. It's a really big change to many governments in the way that they work, but it actually means that you can move to the cloud and you can start to get the benefits of cloud to help your security. And going just back on one of the things Alex said, I remember looking at my inventory as CTO of finding more than 300 data centers that I was officially in charge of, and I couldn't tell anyone whether they'd been patched. I couldn't tell anyone at the beginning whether they'd had the right security added to them. I couldn't tell whether they'd fed the guard dogs outside. It wasn't a thing that was in my scope. And yet, it was really important that we had that. So moving to the cloud meant that we could apply security much more effectively. And we moved originally, the UK government moved to a lot of data to Ireland originally because there was no AWS region in London at the time. So it was quite a controversial move to begin with, but when we realized that we had control over the data and we had control over what we were doing, and we had the keys, it was actually a really sensible move and rationalized a huge amount of the security that we were faced with. So it does sound sometimes counterintuitive, but that move to the cloud increases your security posture and your security capability much more, by a great factor. Anyway, we're going to get on to frequently asked questions, and I'm going to try and interview Alex on this one, which is, right, first one, classic question coming internationally, can the American government see my data?
So particularly, this is a question that comes up a lot in Europe, sometimes driven by politics. Now, sometimes it's coming from a privacy point of view, sometimes a GDPR point of view, sometimes a data sovereignty or just general compliance. I think we always want to think about that regardless of where the question is coming from, it's a reasonable question from the customer point of view, and AWS does not disclose customer content in response to a request unless required to do so to comply with a legally valid and binding order, such as a subpoena or court order. And this is where we go back to security and how security underpins all of this, because customers can choose to encrypt their content as part of the standard security process, and we would recommend they do that. And we have industry-leading encryption services, FIPS 142 attested, that give the kind of customers a range of options about how they encrypt their data in rest and in transit. And AWS, as I mentioned earlier, those services are designed so AWS cannot access the keys to decrypt the data. And if content is encrypted, it is rendered useless without the applicable decryption keys. And we've backed this up in our data protection, GDPR data processing addendum. So recently, we released a supplementary addendum to the GDPR data processing addendum. But it makes some important points that we wanted to reassure customers within our contractual clauses about how far we will go to challenge law enforcement requests. So first, we'll always make every reasonable effort to redirect a government body requesting data to the applicable customer. So second, we will always promptly notify the customer where we permitted to do so. And as I kind of implied just now, we'll always challenge any overbroad or inappropriate requests and sometimes outright sort of rejecting them as well. And it's one thing I think so we always want to disclose the minimum amount necessary. We want to be customer obsessed how we do this.
But that's great in theory. Okay, so what about in practice?
So in practice, it is one thing to say it in theory. So in practice, we have a transparency report about how many law enforcement requests we respond to. So in the most recent report, we have a statement on the transparency report, how many requests resulted in the disclosure of the US government of enterprise content data located outside of the United States? And the answer is none.
What was the one before that?
It was also none. In fact, every time since we've been publishing these transparency reports, the answer has been none. So we've been publishing them since June 2020. And the answer is always none. We've never disclosed data since we've been publishing the transparency reports as a result of a law enforcement request. And in fact, we've processed, you can see in that report, we've also processed 753 requests. So of those, none of them related in the disclosure of data outside of the US. So that is backing up what we say in our contracts with real data that you can see on our website.
Okay. So compliance is always an issue, and if I'm a government or a public service organization, I want to make sure that I comply with data protection laws. How am I certain that happens with AWS?
So slightly comes back to so it's two elements, so the security of the cloud and in the cloud. So of the security of the cloud elements, you can see through our third-party attestations and certifications how we support your compliance efforts. And I think coming back to the UK example, within that list, you don't see a UK certification because the UK government realized that you could secure 96% of its workloads by using and utilizing certifications that already exist,
all the ISOs
rather
and SOCs,
slowing down their innovation and having another one and having people come and inspect things. I think in addition to that, it's really important that as countries, as customers, organizations, you're thinking about your data classification and thinking about what controls, what tools and services you want to add on top of that to meet your own local compliance and regulations. So for example, how do you want to use IAM to kind of minimize who is accessing data? Do you want to make sure that data is never stored outside of the country or the region? And do you want to use guardrails to ensure that? Do you want to make sure that you have to have a single tenant hardware security module for ensuring the keys? And of course, we have teams that can help with that. To meet that, but it's thinking about your own workloads in addition to what AWS offers. But I guess the short answer, and I should have started with this, is yes. Yes, you can meet, and you can be compliant with data protection laws and regulations if you use AWS.
Okay, good. Now, I mean, but AWS control, I mean, if I'm putting my data into AWS, one of my issues and officials regularly come to ask us, surely AWS, because you run it, you can get in and look at the stuff. So surely AWS can get into our customer data anyway.
Well, no. So I think often when people are asking questions about data sovereignty or confidentiality, this is something that's really at the heart of their question. And sometimes it comes from a misunderstanding of how the cloud operates and the kind of the DevOps model, and they assume that perhaps we run a bit like a managed service provider running data centers. But actually, as we've publicly stated, we prohibit and we have systems designed to prevent remote access by AWS personnel to customer data and tools and services access to customer data as well. This includes service maintenance, and we're just maintaining. Sorry, Liam.
But this also ties in, doesn't it, in technical terms, with Nitro. That also is one of the components that really means you're able to explain how we can't access. Do you want to explain?
Yeah, so like it's one thing, again, you think about the zero trust model, it's one thing for us to say we don't access customer content. If you're using Nitro, which is the heart of all our most modern EC2 servers, or most modern chips, so it's in all the Graviton instances, for example, we can't access the data. Nitro is one of these amazing things. I think it's one of the things we're perhaps too humble about. So often in Europe, people talk about confidential computing and encryption in memory. So the Nitro system is something that AWS had invented, but hadn't really talked about when other people started talking about confidential computing. And we realized we had this amazing capability, which was initially designed to improve the efficiency of EC2 processing by separating the data plane, so the bit of the EC2 server that manages customer data, from the bit of the EC2 server that manages the control plane and the scaling up and down. And actually, one of the benefits we now talk about, and we hadn't really talked about before, is by separating the data plane and the control plane, it means that no one in AWS can access the customer data. No person, no tools, no resources. So it's protected from cloud operators, from system software. And then actually, with Nitro Enclaves, if you don't want to trust people within your own organization and you're worried about some sophisticated attacks across your infrastructure, you can also use Nitro Enclaves to protect certain workloads from your own other workloads, which I think is pretty impressive.
Okay. And then the next bit is, but where is my data? Because I want to be certain that I know where my data is. I need to go back to the politicians and explain where the data is and the fact it's stored there. How can you be sure about that?
So I guess it's one thing to say that we're not remotely accessing data, but when we think about the confidentiality and availability and I guess the sovereignty, you want to make sure that the data is staying where you put it. And of course, we will never move in addition to not accessing your data, we will never move it either unless requested or you actively move it yourself. And across the world, we have 84 availability zones and 26 regions. And actually, we've announced plans for 24 more availability zones and 8 more regions, as shown on this map. And I think just taking a step back, if we think about and we understand what goes into a region, and it goes back to that point I was making earlier about anti-cloud patterns when you hear the term sovereign cloud. So our regions are designed for incredible amounts of resiliency. So within each region is made up of 3 or more availability zones, and within each availability zones you have multiple separate data centers. So this is where you get some of that scalability, that resilience from is within the design of the regions. And we'll never move the data outside of that region. If we think about Europe, where I think that, again, it's a very hot topic, data protection. I talked about the CISP Code of Conduct, and we have 52 services under the CISP Code of Conduct, which show that we go above and beyond what's required by GDPR, and that's been all third-party independently verified. And then I think the statement I showed earlier, which said, publicly states that AWS isn't accessing data for any reason, we have systems that prevent that. Also in that page, we list out all of our services and we list out, as I talked about earlier, whether the customer can encrypt the data, delete the data, and it confirms there's no remote access. Also within that page, we outline the few services where the data does move globally. For example, content distribution network service, CloudFront. So by its nature, it has to move data. We also have 11 services which are machine learning and artificial intelligence services, where some of the learning information to develop and improve those services can be transferred, but customers can opt out of that. And if we think about Control Tower, that's one of the guardrails you can put in place to make sure that as people within your organization use AI or ML services, they don't accidentally opt back in and move that data across.
So if I store my data and I say I'm going to store my data in a particular place, I can actually ensure that for everything, apart from services where you do need to share data globally by their very nature, you store the data there.
Yeah, I mean, so I think what this comes back down to is if you put your data in a region, in a country, and you go back to the initial definition of sovereignty, you're within that country's laws and you have control over that data. You then have, you're then benefiting from the full benefits of cloud, from the scalability, speed of innovation, flexibility, and also security of the cloud. You can then make sure that, and we have systems to prevent that no one is accessing that data, it's not moved out of the region. And then if you don't want to trust what we say, we have data to back that up in terms of law enforcement requests. And we have, you can use the Nitro system to actually, so we can't actually access it even if we wanted to.
So one of the things that, just to summarize here, is there are sort of three main points, but the core component of the work that we do with public services is based around not just their trust with their citizens, but their trust with us. And so what we've tried to do with all of our work around control is to make sure that customer trust is possible. Customers are able to have the highest level of trust with us because they're able to see what the control is, work with it, audit it, see what's actually going on, and at that point be in a position where they know the access to their data, where their data is, and who's been using it and who's been working with it. So there's that trust enables governments and public service organizations to be able to work more effectively with their users and be able to explain the compliance that they have with their users clearly and effectively. Because remember, in a government situation, governments are in a way a monopoly environment. The government is for everybody, but it also needs to be transparent. It needs to be consultative. It needs to be able to explain its actions. And that's one of the reasons why we've put so much work behind these controls to make sure that any public service organization can explain the technical measures that have been put in place. And Alex has given a great example there through from encryption through to Nitro, the process measures we have in place to make sure that data is processed effectively and clearly and transparently. And then also our contractual measures around the laws and requirements that we have in place. So we feel that there is a really strong story for the ability to exercise control over citizens' data and personal information, which supports that move to a high-grade, high-security situation across governments, where they also have the flexibility and the opportunity to use the whole of the cloud. And I just want to make that sure that we're getting that point across. Our approach around this is to make sure that the great depth and breadth of services that AWS offers is available to everybody whilst maintaining that control. And that's a really important thing that our customers have come to us and asked for. And I'd be really keen to hear your views on whether that's resonating or whether we're doing that with them. We've covered a huge amount of text and work in this area. And so what we thought rather than sort of like continue to blurt out data, is actually just give you some ideas and some pointers for this. So we have a number of resources available, particularly for partners. And so the authority to operate on AWS program helps AWS partners meet their customers' authorization needs, whether that's architecting, configuring, deploying, or integrating tools and controls. And ATO on AWS supports workloads for government organizations such as FedRAMP, FISMA, the RMF, CMMC in the US, GDPR, and other for EU and UK and other based regions, and also the Government Canada Protected B Information Security Registered Associates Professor in program in Australia, and ISO 27700. So it's a really strong set of compliance requirements that are met by the authority to operate engagement. And then, as Alex mentioned earlier, ClearStart is a way of helping make sure that you've put in place the guardrails so that if you're putting data and working with citizen data, you're able to be really clear about where that's stored, how it's stored, and know that you've got that in place. And then there are a number of landing pages. There's data protection, there's a EU data protection pages on our website, and also the Data Privacy Center and GDPR Center across the AWS website. So do please use those terms to look for, and it should be relatively easy to search for those components within the site. We've also got a wide range of white papers and ebooks which we're making available and which are available on there, but particularly the Navigating Compliance with Data Transfer Requirements. That white paper we found is really powerful. And then Understanding Confidential Computing. At the bottom, there's a really good blog which goes through how Nitro works and how we approach confidential computing. And a couple of videos as well. Goodness, yes, that's good, with the great Esther Stringham and Hans Bors to take you through the engagement. So we think there's a lot of requirements, a lot of resources there as well available to you to try and help you just get to grips with and try and get to the bottom of how we approach this. But added to that, one of the reasons why we really wanted to do today was to have a bit of a Q&A and some feedback and questions from you and see whether we can answer those as well as we go through our approach to this. So once I put the next slide up, can we just ask for questions within the audience? And then as that's going on, please do identify with that. There's that message going through. So,
Some front.
You mentioned briefly that the UK government has consistent approach to data classification.
Sorry, is the mic coming around?
Good morning, and thank you. You mentioned earlier that the UK government had a consistent approach to data classification that ranged from intelligence and defense to law enforcement to social services. Could you talk a little bit more about that and what it's called so we can interested folks can do some more research?
yeah, so there's a really, so two explanations of that. One, there's the official papers, which is if you just search for data classification on GovUK, it should pull up the papers around that, and on data classification UK government, that pulls up the pages with the current documents on that, and also going back to 2013 when we first issued the papers around that. The second point, if you want a bit of a narrative around it, was there's a film which we made with myself and the main security lead on that engagement where we talk through how that works. That's, I can give you the link to it. If you just look up, the interesting thing is that if you put Maxwell and Ung, A-U-N-G, on that, that's available on the AWS Institute website as a video, and that should also help talk through the process we used and the way that we address that. But the papers are fairly comprehensive now because obviously they're used, and we're very open about how they were working within government and across other government departments. Thank you.
One at the front, and then we'll go to the back.
Good morning. I was wondering if you guys could maybe expound on serverless workloads, Lambda, Beanstalk. We're just getting into that area, and it seems like from a privacy and governance perspective that we're transitioning or shifting some of that responsibility more towards the AWS side, because in those serverless workloads, the controls are inheritable. Maybe you could expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, so I guess the short answer to that, when you think about the responsibility model, depending on the level of management within the service depends on how much responsibility you have to take as a customer. So some of those more managed services, like Elastic Beanstalk is a really good example. Actually, the heavy lifting of security on Elastic Beanstalk is done much more by AWS than by the customer. And so in regulated industries, we see them take more and more of the kind of managed databases rather than the kind of raw databases down the stack, because more of the security, more of the patching is taken care of. If I take Lambda as a sort of an example, I was talking about the Spectre vulnerability. The servers managing Lambda were patched within 2 days. So again, you're using infrastructure as code, and it's all patched and managed, and you don't have to worry about it. So from a security point of view, actually, again, this goes in line with the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre's advice and UK's Ministry of Defence advice. If you can, use more of the managed services, because security is our job zero, and we do it at such big scale that you can be assured that you're going to get more security and benefit from that focus that we have. And there's a question at the back.
Yeah, much of public sector around the world is also related to healthcare.
Yep.
And many of the AWS services are from a healthcare perspective, are labeled as HIPAA eligible versus actually being HIPAA compliant. Can you explain the difference and what it means to be eligible versus actually HIPAA compliant?
So to make sure I give the answer precisely, I might want to follow up with that. I'll answer in a slightly different context around GDPR, which I'm more familiar with. So this comes to when we talked, I guess, the shared responsibility model and the slide with the third-party attestations. So If you're using AWS services, you still have to take responsibility for ensuring compliance for how you use the data and the tools and services you put on top of that. So we can't say, yes, you're definitely compliant by using this particular service, because we don't know how you'll manage your application on top of it. So it's how you use the tools and services in managing security in the cloud to make sure that you're HIPAA compliant. But we can say, well, these are eligible because in terms of our part of the stack, we can only assure our part. We can't do the bit on terms of how you manage the application.
But we'll come back to you on that.
Yeah, we'll double check. And so time for one more question? Yep.
And next slide. Or-
Hi there. A quick question from me. In terms of how do I phrase this? Actually, I need to give a little bit of background. So I work for a UK consulting company, and we have a lot of clients who obviously want to make use of the infrastructure and everything. And this whole presentation for me has been absolutely fantastic, and it's what I basically translate to our customers. But if those customers want to reach out to you directly, and apart from me, saying here's a website, how do I create the relationship between AWS and said customers so they can hear this level of assurance and, more specifically the piece about how you protect the data, how you can't disclose the information, if they want to hear it directly from you rather than from me in an advisory perspective?
I mean, we can do that, and we also are putting together, and it's one of the things we mentioned the Institute earlier, is that the ability to put across videos of what we're doing as well, we found really helpful in terms of making that engagement scalable and repeatable to a large number of people. But do please come through to us through your account or your partner account team to come and help us, help you try and leverage that message across. We're really finding that consistency of message is the most important thing at this point. And there are lots and lots of, it's a sort of new area in the last 2 years, full of ambiguity. And so getting that consistency is really important. So we'd love to be able to just link up and give you the information straight from the horse's mouth, as it were.
And as a consulting partner, we can help support you in enabling you to have these conversations on your own as well. And that's partly how the authority to operate on the AWS program works. But we can follow up on that.
But your feedback on how to do that better as well would be really important to us. One more.
We're allowed one more question, so
really good session to start the day, guys. Congratulations for that. I know my question's going to sound like I'm challenging you, but it really goes a little bit to the last question of being able to communicate with customers. In your FAQs, you had a really interesting slide that said, access to law enforcement from data outside the United States, none. There's a flip side to that coin. Are there metrics for data inside the United States?
Yes, so on the transparency report, it contains all the information. Most of the challenging questions we get from customers are outside the United States. And of course, there is United States laws to protect United States citizens as well. And that transparency report is much more than that kind of paragraph. It goes into full detail of all the disclosures.
We've got one here.
Yep, please.
My turn. Hey, good morning. Homomorphic encryption, computationally still on the horizon. I'm sure you guys have been discussing it internally. Just wanted to know kind of where AWS's thinking was with homomorphic encryption, which is the performing transformations and ultimately driving insights from data that never leaves an encrypted state.
So that's a quite sophisticated question. So I think without giving a sort of slightly trite answer, I think when we say security is job zero, and when the UK Ministry of Defence talks about why using commercial cloud is more secure, it's because we manage so many millions of customers' workloads, and we invest so much in R&D to protect the security, because if we don't keep our cloud secure, there's no point us doing business. That's what we mean by job zero. So any innovation that's coming along, you can be assured that we are investing in the R&D in how we can benefit from that. Confidential computing is an interesting example of how that's happened in the past, where something was announced around confidential computing, and actually we'd already invented the equivalent and already using it. I think what we've learned from that is we need to be more open about security benefits as we release them, rather than just kind of build them on the inside.
Because a lot of what we've discovered through this whole program is a lot of the components of what we're building in our security are answers for the compliance that are being put in place already. And so part of what our team's job is to do is to make that join up and explain it more effectively.
And as a principle, like trust is really important to us. And the way you earn trust is almost sort of backing it up with data and almost saying you don't need to trust us. And I think having a scenario where you can have full envelope encryption and there's no point within the chain can we ever access the data or intercept the data is a kind of innovation we want to care about, because it means you have to trust us less. And so that's definitely something I imagine we would think about, but I have no insight myself.
Got another one.
Hi, good morning. Congratulations as well, very clear
Speak up, please.
presentation. For Latin America, one of the inhibitors of cloud adoption is the concern of where is located and compute and process the data. So I only find 3 available zones in Latin America based in Sao Paulo. How do you manage the solutions, for example, in which they are not expecting to move to the public cloud, but remain in their own data centers, data lakes, and private cloud? So how do you balance that solutions between the public cloud and new solutions like Outposts, for example, for private cloud?
So I guess there's 2 parts to this answer. So one, those are the regions we have today, and we're always looking to expand where our infrastructure is. And at reInvent, we announced quite a large number of local zones, some of which are in Latin America. Additionally, I think it sometimes comes about a whole risk-based decision. So if you're thinking about the security of your workloads, yes, from an organizational point of view, there may be a sovereignty risk if you want to store the data outside the country and use our region, for example, in Sao Paulo. But you should be weighing that up against the risks of managing a single data center, patching the hardware and firmware against that data center, the resiliency of having all your data in one place. And it's thinking about that broader risk-based kind of weighing up those broad risks. But we're happy to pull up on the conversation.
And if you think about the example we had in Ireland, that I was giving you earlier about the UK and Ireland, there was in 2014, there was no region in the United Kingdom. And therefore, we did take that decision. Where is the safest place? Where do we get the most and the highest security posture? And the highest security posture was by putting it in the cloud in Ireland. Now, I know that sometimes people have issues around data residency and those issues, which is a balance. But when you think about the extra security that you get and the extra repeatability and the consistency of that security compared to running it on your own servers and your own systems and your own on-premise, that's a particularly compelling argument that we found for moving to the cloud, on top of the massive cost savings, the flexibility, the agility, et cetera. We announced a cloud first policy in 2013, and that was because we were doing it for security. So that was the reason why. So, and it's a very similar situation in countries where there is no region in place at the moment.
Thank you so much. We'll be hovering around
much
for a bit. We need to go, obviously, let the next session start. Please fill in the session survey and enjoy the rest of your day and enjoy the rest of the summit. Thank you so much.
Thank you.